Afternoon, everyone. So that was certainly a mouthful. So I've basically taken the entire talk and broken it up into how do you become more profitable in the poultry industry. So to make more money in poultry, you either need to purchase better, you either need to produce better, or you need to sell better. And those are the three fundamentals of being in business. And I think probably the easiest one over there is to say, how do you purchase better? So in order to purchase better, you either conduct a spend analysis, you go through some form of consolidation to say, well, you know, we've got one guy that's going to buy for everyone. We get out of bad habits like spending when we have breakdowns as opposed to having things that are there. We get to places where we say, okay, you know what, the inflation in this country is going to go 20%. Isn't it worth our while to do something a bit more fundamental on purchasing the right spares at the right time or the right ingredients at the right time? And then obviously you go from there to say, well, what does it cost to actually produce whatever it is that I'm buying, in the case of a feed mill? So is it worth your while to purchase feed, or is it worth your while to manufacture feed? Certainly in all our modeling that we've done, if a feed mill is running at capacity, it's normally the easiest sell at corporate level because the payback is under 3 years. But yeah, when you start talking about broilers, different story. Now we start looking at a payback of 10 years. And that's why if you look in South Africa, our entire business model is growing the contract growers as opposed to spending money on building broiler houses. Okay? That makes sense. So in producing better, there are quite a couple of ideas that you can have a look at which might help you. So I want us to have a look at numbers. And what we essentially did is we took the table egg industry, the broiler breeder industry, the day-old chick industry, and then obviously the broilers on their own as well, to say what are the sensitivities around all of those different facets of poultry production, and what happens when you change something with 1 cent in a sizable business. What does it do to the bottom line every time? So although it's worked out in rands, I've got the dollar figures with me. We can just discuss them as we go through. So we started with the table egg production, and we said the eggs that we produce would be 467 with about 11.5% mortality at 100 weeks. We took maize at 4,500 Rand a ton and soya at 9,300. And then once we did that, we said, okay, how sensitive would those numbers be at the end of the day on a sizable size operation? So we said, if you had 200,000 layers on the floor and you moved your egg cost with 1 cent, it would basically mean 500,000 Rand or $27,000 to your bottom line at the end of the day, okay, annually. Now, if you look on the table egg size, we never found any data, and I mean, we threw everything at this. We said, let's put in 20% mortality. Let's bump up the price of feed. Let's give these birds a disease challenge. Let's drop production. Let's. And we went down, and it's the most robust form of poultry production there is the table egg industry. Because you can hit these birds with basically anything you want to. Every time they lay an egg, they end up diluting the cost that you spent. And the number just keeps coming down. As long as somebody is willing to purchase the egg, it's getting better. So eventually, after the model flatlines, we took the whole thing, we said, let's go to 130 weeks. If somebody was still willing to buy those eggs at 130 weeks, with the same rate of degeneration in your laying numbers, would you be reducing costs or wouldn't you? And in the table egg industry, you would still continue to reduce cost and reduce cost and reduce cost But I mean, obviously that line gets flatter and flatter and flatter. I'll show you on the broiler breeders how that thing flattens out and eventually goes back up again. If we have a look at on the broilers, not great numbers, but these were actuals. And at this point, we were looking at a low density feed to see what it was going to do. And we said, right, at 1.7 kilos with the FCR of 1.67, our mortality then was around about 6%. We're slaughtering at 33.7 days. And again, maize and soya at the same kind of prices. Said, what would happen? So remember when this happened with the maize price, and like nobody saw that coming. Because everybody was like, maize is going to sit just over 2,500. And suddenly we had these huge jumps kick into the industry. And maize started running up to the 5,000 mark that we spoke about earlier. Nobody sees that coming. And the people that did see it coming and the people that did adjust it obviously made a lot more money out of it because of the fact that they had hedged themselves properly for that kind of thing. But obviously everybody else that was in spot, you died. And you say, well, why did it happen? Then you have a look at the fertilizer records, and this first little spike over here sees when the oil price in the world jumped, and everybody in the US thought, well, we'll plant corn and produce ethanol and make cheap fuel, and created this huge shortage, and the fertilizer prices jumped. And then the Ukraine came along and the whole world ran out of ammonia, and that pushed the prices to where they are now again. How does that play into Africa? Africa sits especially in our underdeveloped countries. We don't get access to fertilizer. Governments are stepping in to try and help with these fertilizer bonds that they're putting out to say, let's help the industry. Does it actually transpire down to the lower level? Well, hardly ever. Taking those into account, if you have a look at broiler costs, you generally sit with about 70+% in feed, about 90% in your chick costs, and the balance of that number is about another 7% of costs that could actually at the end of the day be diluted if you placed a few more birds on the same kind of bedding. The labor is going to be the same, the heating is going to be the same. So then people start saying, well, okay, isn't there then an effect on thinning? And we say sensitivity-wise, if you're in an operation that produces 1 million birds a week, 1 cent would then cost you essentially R1 million a year. So every time you can dilute your broiler costs with 1 cent, you add $1 million down the line, or $50,000 you add onto the bottom line. That in itself, now you start saying, well, if 1 cent is worth $1 million in an operation like this, what is the effect of thinning? So those of you that understand a thinning model is you place a certain percentage of your birds in the back of the house, you cordon it off, you then sex some of your birds so that you can place males in the front of the house, and you then grow those birds to a certain kgs per square meter, take out the front of the house at whatever that weight is, and then allow the back of the house to then grow up to the same amount of kilograms per square meter. Okay? But now, if you look at average slaughter weight at 35 days between open and closed houses, this varies. Because an open house is never going to give you the same weight as a closed house. And that data there, that's 10 million broilers you're looking at. So from a practical point of view, there's at least 100 grams difference between open housing and closed housing all the time. And if you say, well, where does that come in? Well, it comes in because the open house cannot give you the same kg per square meter. Okay? The open house will always give you around about 32, 33 kilograms per square meter, and then you start hitting the ceiling. And I don't want to go past that. And you get to the controlled environment houses, and now you're talking about 38 to 40 kilograms a square meter that you can take off quite comfortably. If you then go on and you have a look and you say, well, remember that 7%, what can you do with it? Okay, to explain this, I'm going to be here for about a minute or so. Essentially, we said if that was the standard and we're producing our 37 kgs a square meter on a thinning model where we took 21 birds in the back of the house and 3 birds in the front of the house that we were going to slaughter early, we grew them out to 1.5 kgs, then allowed the balance to then grow out to 1.9 kgs. You then increased yourself the 37 plus the 4.7 to 41 kilos. You save 10 cents. That 10 cents, if you were a big operation, would be 10 million rand. If you did the same thing on model number 2, with taking 20 birds and 4 birds, you'd save 14. If you took 19 and 5 birds, you'd save 16. So this is why the thinning model there's an opportunity, okay? But there's also a big stick. And the big stick is biosecurity. Because remember, if you allow a catching team onto your farm at 28 days when you're taking those birds out, you've broken all biosecurity. So if you want thinning to work on a commercial basis, the catching team for the thinning is a separate team. Okay? It's a separate truck. It's separate crates. It's a complete medical procedure to come in, take those birds out and get off the farm. Okay? It's like the first thing that happens in the day. The first birds that go to the abattoir are the thin birds. There's a cost involved, but there's a benefit involved in it. Okay, on the broiler discussion, we said feed is obviously always the biggest contributor. Anything related to feed cost is going to have the biggest effect on you at the end of the day. Okay, you need to learn to push. The nutritionist has to have access to trial houses. That is key. I'm telling you, the nutritionist has to have access to trial houses. Always. Keep checking and keep chipping. It's the only way. Okay. Raw materials can annihilate you. You've seen how those huge spikes of it. There's got to be a strategy. Okay. If we have a look at breeder baseline assumptions, we took 175 eggs at 64 weeks because that's what we achieved on the Ross 308. We had 140 chicks that came out of those birds. Okay, also at 64, and then again we kept maize and soya at the same price. And essentially, what that would mean for you is that every cent that you could save on that similar size operation, again, puts a 500,000 rand onto your bottom line for every cent. Okay, and this is quite important because if you have a look at your standard egg cost, obviously when the bird's coming to lay is way up there because you've spent all the money on the breeder, you've spent all the money on the feed, you have vaccinated this animal to the absolute hilt, it's coming into lay. So the first egg, if you've got to dilute it by what you spent on it, is obviously a fortune. And then as the bird starts to lay, this number just keeps coming down. Okay. And it looks brilliant because by the time you get to 74 weeks, you're sort of hitting the lowest number possible. And you're saying to yourself, if I was producing breeding eggs, okay, then 74 weeks would be the number. Okay. That would be my lowest egg cost possible. Okay. But now, you would have to increase feed cost in broiler breeders by like 30% to try and get that number at the end to start moving back up and take yourself away from that week 74. All right? So you really got to throw money at the thing to start pulling it back. And you're saying to yourself, well, 74 weeks, you know, what's the hatchability, what's the fertility? Let's have a look at that one. So day-old chicks is different. You've got production and you've got hatchability that's declining. And while hatchability is declining and production is declining, this number now starts to move back. Okay? And if you look in the South African industry, a lot of people, where do they deplete? 62, 63 weeks. Okay. And our modeling says 66 weeks, you hit the cheapest possible day-old chick cost. Okay. The cheapest possible cost at 62 weeks. The difference between the 62 weeks and the 63 weeks, it just adds another cent or two to your day-old chick cost without you knowing it. Because why? You're not measuring it. Because why? Historically, we said we deplete the birds at 63 weeks. Okay. Now, before I move on this one, when we started in Midway was a group of entrepreneurs, essentially, that came together and said, we're going to start producing day-old chicks for our factories. And they didn't pay anyone a salary. And they said, okay, you know what we'll do? We'll pay each person for the amount of chicks that leave the hatchery at the end of the day. And that way, they kept the hatchery costs variable. And when they made money, the staff made money. So that change in mindset, if I can explain it to you, because people love to measure things like eggs per hen housed, what's your hatchability, what is the reject rate, but they don't put it into rands and cents. When somebody is being paid for how many chicks leave the door, let me tell you, suddenly the reject rate on the farm comes down to 3%. It just does, because you know what? We're not looking at it to say, how good am I going to look if this thing hatches? We're saying, how good is my bank account going to look if there's a chick in here? And that is a change, okay? Let's say, and this is something similar. I mean, how many people actually achieve that breed standard? Like, not many, normally. And hatchability does tank, okay? And now suddenly, the cheapest cost moves itself over to 68 weeks, okay? A little bit further. But the difference between good hatchability and poor hatchability is still 5 cents, so there's still $2.5 million lying on there. And that is a factor. But although there's $2.5 million lying on there, the reality is still the cheapest cost on the broiler breeder is later than what you think. I mean, obviously, the next question is, how do we achieve more? So, it's not very clear, but I'll explain it to you. I did this trial where I wanted to see how can I affect embryonic livability in older breeder flocks. So we had 7 treatments, and what we were looking at is to say, well, is there an effect with turning eggs while you're preheating them? So preheating is when you take eggs from 18 degrees up to incubation temperature. Is there an effect or isn't there an effect? And how can you change that? So we essentially said, okay, you know what, if we follow the old conventional method and we just said, take the eggs out, throw them in the passages at 24, do nothing. What is that as a baseline? And there we're talking about flocks that are 53 weeks plus. Okay. Then we said, well, what else can we do? So, well, we can turn eggs every 15 minutes, or we can turn eggs every hour. We can heat them up really quickly, okay, by putting them inside or in between embryos of 13 weeks and see, or 13 days, and see if we heat them up very quickly, do we get an embryonic response out of that or not? And then at the same time, if we do no preheating and we just say, you know what, you're 18, put it in an incubator, set the thing to 38 degrees, either turn it every 60 minutes or turn it every 15 minutes, let's see what happens. So, results. The turning frequencies there at the top, 0, 15, and 60 minutes. The rapid preheating, where also we turn them at 15 minutes and 60 minutes, said, well, you know, difference 15 minutes, obviously better than 60 minutes in that case. Only 8.5% of the embryos died during the rapid stage. The standard preheating gave us 25%. And this now starts to play into something else, because when you start looking at old flocks, many times you start saying to yourself, I've got a fertility problem here. Look how the fertility is falling. But these embryos are dying so early that when you start checking at 96 hours, you see, but cell development was taking place here. Okay. We then had a look at those same embryos, and we said at 15 minutes, what would happen if we just did standard preheating, and what would happen if we did no preheating. So there was no significant difference between no preheating and standard preheating, and there's no significant difference basically between no preheating, standard preheating that you turned every 60 minutes. So out of that we got to say, well, turning is a thing. Okay? And if you're scraping for the 1% and 2%, here's something you can look at. Let me show you this. When you're looking for 1%, if you're measuring, and I mean you're really measuring. So what we did in this case is everybody candles, and as good poultry people, we record whatever we candle, and from there we can go in and we can say, well, the fertility on this tray is X. And by the time they hatch, we can attribute a certain percentage of those chicks back to the amount that were fertile. And based on that number, we can then say, well, we have a hatch of fertile now per tray, building up over time. So if you look at a machine over 6 months, you start to see a pattern emerge. So the lighter trays had a hatch of fertile that was 2% better than the darker trays. Okay? So in this case over here, funny enough, probes in these machines sat over here. All of these were brilliant. Those were fantastic. It was almost as if we started seeing overheating happen there, and in those back too. And because you measure it, you can now start saying, how do I adjust that? And just playing with the pressures, we eventually started moving that there to all go white. So it's not to say that's the answer to all incubation problems. It's to say that if you measure, you'll be able to start seeing what you can change. How do you get that little bit extra added to it? Okay. There's this wonderful thing called the reticular activation system. So the RAS is a bundle of nerves that distorts or deletes or keeps information that it deems to be important to you. In the case of we're all sitting here, a lion roars outside here, you know what? Your head is not going to delete that. It's going to say, we need to run. And it comes down to this, and it says, every person sees everything differently. Okay. In a case of a pencil, you give a pencil to an artist, he sees a picture. You give the same pencil to a dog, and he sees a toy. And you give the same pencil to John Wick, and he sorts out a problem in a nightclub. The reality of everything when it comes to broilers is there's always a constant dilution in egg production costs. Okay. The RAS tells you that nobody has all the answers. No one. If you ever want to do yourself one good favor, find the best nutritionist, the best vet, okay, and get yourself a specialist in whatever you're doing, whether it's hatcheries, broilers, breeders. Get the right guy. Put the right people in the room, and that's the fastest way you make progress. And just measure everything. Everything. I want us to move on to some of the fun stuff. So there's essentially a couple of things that are going to change within Zimbabwe, and we can have a look at why that will be in the next few slides. But I just want to show you two models in consumer behavior, which is the traditional model and the contemporary model, which is stimulus related. So we go along to the first one and we say, in the learning model, I have to satisfy a need, and then once I've satisfied that need, I will then, and a need can be obviously food, clothing, shelter kind of thing, And after that, I will go to a learned need, which is guilt or fear, whatever the case is. So a hungry guy will pass up buying airtime to buy a piece of chicken, and once he's satisfied his hunger, he has fear that his wife is going to kill him because he hasn't phoned her, so he goes to buy airtime. Right. The stimulus model says everything is based on product price, place, and promotion. So I'm walking home, I feel like Nando's, but there's a chicken ink, it's at the right place. There's a special on the burger, I'm going to grab that, and because it's on promotion, it works for me, and off I go. And you know what? Better yet, if I know the product, better yet, if it fits my pocket. So these are the things that play into whether I'm going to buy it or not. Okay? Interestingly enough, the thing now comes down to, it says, will consumers purchase more protein in the future? And it says, the increase in the rate of urbanization will translate into changing consumer habits when consumers go through this nutritional transition. So the higher income always results into first a higher demand for more calories. And once I eat more calories, the next thing I want is, I want more protein. And once I want more protein, I normally want to take protein from animal sources. Okay? So, if you look at this next graph, it says, what is the meat consumption per person? And that data was in 2020. And it says, okay, there's the meat consumption around the world. Okay? Africa is here below 40 grams, and between 40 and 160 grams is the yellow, and then obviously the pink ones are over 165 grams. So you can see Europe, the Americas, obviously Brazil, Australia, New Zealand, China obviously fits into that picture. And it says these places are consuming more meat at that point. And the thing that drives it is this, GDP. Okay. The total monetary or market value of all finished goods and services produced within a country's border at a specific time. This drives how you eat. Okay, so GDP per capita. GDP per capita, high areas, eat more protein. Okay. GDP per capita, low. And the GDP per capita is to say, there's $5,000 per person here, therefore we eat 20 grams of protein. Or there's $50,000 per person in this country, therefore they eat 170 grams of protein. Okay. Right, then. Interesting one. Life expectancy. Life expectancy, believe it or not, GDP. So we earn more, we live longer. Okay? Because we eat good food. Let me tell you a quick story. This is true for most countries, except for there's 8 tribes in the world that kill this graph. And these are small pockets of people. I'm going to tell you a story about one of them. Here between China and India. So 2,300 years ago, when Alexander the Great was busy fighting Darius in Persia, they had this issue that they nearly lost this battle. And Alexander said to himself, but 3 of his top generals have got Persian wives, and he was sure that these 3 guys had sold him out. So he sends his personal guard to assassinate them. They hear about this and fight their way out, and they flee over the Hunza Gorge, okay, which is 3,000 feet down. There's a bridge made of goat hair, and these guys get across and settle on the other side of the gorge. Only problem is it's 99% barren. It's rock. There's nothing. Okay? So there's no rock. The water is 3,000 feet down. Obviously, as there's rock, there's no vegetation. So the only way to do anything as far as irrigation or as far as planting is concerned is to go and dredge the gorge at the bottom, take sand out, carry it back up to where the rocks are, build terraces, empty the sand in there, and start planting. Okay? But now there's also no water. So the one guy that escapes is an engineer in the military, and he embarks on bringing in water from a glacier which is 80 kilometers away by carving out tree trunks and hammering them to the side of the gorge to bring the water down. So there's a gravity-fed aqueduct down to where they're irrigating and where they're getting water from. But the one thing about the water coming off this Ultar glacier is that there's 60 different minerals in this stuff. And they start irrigating all their cabbages and everything else that they do. They feed the animals out of here, and they drink and consume. So essentially, they learn to live on this rock. What happens is that as the glacier compresses that ground, it drops it down by 4 inches every year. And all those minerals that are coming out there are about 7,000 times smaller than the human red blood cell. Those minerals are taken up in the plants, and the people consume those plants, and the Hunza Valley people live to over 100. They work 12 hours a day, every day, 7 days a week, because they say work doesn't kill you. Apparently, in their case, it doesn't. But it's the intracellular colloidal minerals that keep them alive. And this is the thing. You say, okay, well, what do we do in Zimbabwe because there's no glaciers? Where will we find the colloidal minerals? And the answer to that is you're going to start picking it up, or you're going to start picking up a lot of your minerals out of your meat. Why? Because the nutritionist is going to make sure that the chicken is healthy. And if the chicken's healthy, you'll get healthy. If you're eating cartilage of the chicken bones, you're fixing your own cartilage. If you're not getting access to selenium, you're going to die of a heart attack. If you're not getting access to copper, you're going to have an embolism at the end of the day. So these things play through. I can't believe it's only 10. Right. So life expectancy in Zimbabwe. If you have a look at where we currently are, back at about 60 years, there was this period there where we were down in 2000 and I believe it was 2000 and just over, between 2000 and 2010, where the life expectancy in Zimbabwe fell down to 40. And you think, wow, that is low. And the reality is, GDP back here fell down to below 1,500 rand or $1,500 per person living here. Okay, and as that increased again, the life expectancy increased with it. Okay, if you look at protein supply from animal foods, GDP per capita, there it is. South Africa here, Zimbabwe down there, just over 20 grams. South Africa up here, we've got quite a strong social structure, so you can basically draw a line through that. If you draw a line through that, you can say to yourself, at $5,000 per capita, I eat 18 grams of protein. At 50,000, I eat 70 grams of protein. If I want to increase the consumption of protein within the country by 1 gram, I need to increase the GDP by $860 per person. Simple as that. Okay. How do I do that? Or how much is that, should I say? It would be the equivalent of producing an extra 2.5 million eggs a day, or it would be the equivalent of producing 54,000 broilers a day to consume that amount of protein. Okay, there's an entire integration lying in 1 gram of protein within a country like this. Okay. If you look at eating habits, there was some research done by the IDS and Oxfam in all of these countries down here. You'll get it later. But interesting enough here is Kenya and Zambia are in here. Okay, and they wanted to see how are eating habits changing within countries. So they said, along with this accelerated urbanization and along with people having a need to feed themselves, they are taking more demeaning and more dangerous jobs in an effort to feed themselves and to feed their family. So what happens? They work longer and harder, they migrate to towns, okay, and most of them start turning towards QSR. And that's why you're seeing in Africa suddenly there's this bump coming in the QSR, right? Unfortunately for this whole thing is that women are the worst affected by it. Okay? Because women need to put food on the table for their kids. Right. If you look at growth within South Africa, we're going to go from 43 million to 60 million in a period of 4 years, QSR. That's what we forecast to do. Okay. It's about 1,500 outlets. Zimbabwe's population at the moment is about a quarter of ours. Okay. Our rate of urbanization in South Africa at the moment is 67%. Zimbabwe's is climbing at a rate of 1% per year. So you've got about 180,000 people moving to town every single year. Okay. Restaurant delivery system will change by $1 million in the next 4 years. Harare Bulawayo, essentially. Okay. So GDP changes, urbanization increases, more QSRs will emerge because more people will consume more animal protein. It's sort of written. That's what's going to happen. Okay. If you have a look at how do you change GDP, yeah, it's just a couple of graphs showing you how other countries, most of them have changed like 50% over the last 50 years. Zimbabwe still had that dip, it's flatlining. We're hoping, okay, that more and more and more will happen very soon because we currently sit with a trade deficit of 2.1 billion, okay, which negatively impacts your GDP. Why? Because the money is going out. And you start asking yourself, why in South Africa are we importing chicken? It should be legislated not to. Okay? Because lower GDP means the lower end of the population doesn't eat chicken. Okay? If you have a look at maize production, there's about $300-400 million missing in maize production where we used to be at, what is it, 3+ million tons down to 1.6. If you have a look at this thing on the Kaldor hypothesis, it says manufacturing will pull GDP, and what happens behind it is this whole service industry comes running. Okay, so I make motor cars, and because I make motor cars, teachers are working, doctors are working, lawyers are working, schools are working, children are being educated, universities are coming, and it all happens due to this one thing about manufacturing. Manufacturing is the biggest driver. All right. So it says that growth and employment in most service sectors follow GDP. They don't happen on their own. If you look at the US, where they moved manufacturing back to the US, suddenly it's not because everybody went to work in manufacturing, it's because suddenly the service industry boomed. How did it boom? I'll show you that now. Quick one. In Germany, you've got these 4 or 5 big companies, Volkswagen, Daimler Services, Bayer, BASF, and these massive companies, you think to yourself, well, they're contributing everything, but the reality is they're not. There's this group of family-owned businesses within the German economy called the Mittelstand, and these Mittelstand people go along and they say, or they provide work to about 70+% of the German economy, right? You think, well, how is that? I mean, so essentially what happens is these guys have developed something, and the government through its policies supports the fact that these guys have developed something, and in them developing something it says, okay, you have become a small master in whatever it is that you're trading. Okay? So they have R&D funding for these small family-owned businesses. They support students through government loans to keep the technology and to keep the innovation going. Okay. If you look where, oh, skip that. Let's move on. Small businesses in Zimbabwe at the moment, we have 1.6 million small businesses. Okay. They at the moment contribute $14 billion in turnover and about $8.6 million every year into GDP within the country. The more of these guys there are, the more chicken they can eat. Okay. In the US, 86% of all employment comes from the service industry. Okay. And if you look in agriculture, there's about 500,000 people that actually contribute towards agriculture in a country of 360 million people. Okay. In Zimbabwe at the moment, it's about 56% of all people are in the service industry. There's a huge gap here that can still be filled. Okay. Even if we're making wheelbarrows, the service industry will follow this. Okay. The problem is this, the skills deficit. We 94% of, we don't have engineering, we don't have any natural sciences. Agriculture is 88% below what it should be. The medical profession is minus 95. The skills in agriculture aren't there, the skills in the medical industry is not there, the skills in everything is not there. Okay, except maybe business and commerce. So, I've got 3 slides. Here's a great one, because at the moment there's this big hype within, let's just say, Southern Africa about energy, okay? Everybody renewables, and because of the renewables, we're all going to have solar panels and batteries. And here's a group of youngsters from MIT that decided they're going to drill a hole 20 kilometers deep. So the deepest hole at the moment in the world is down at 12 kilometers. And that was done by the Russians. And the guys from MIT said, you know what, we'll come along and we've developed technology that can now drill without using abrasion. So the plan is next year to drill down to 20 kilometers and produce their first pipe, which will produce 100 kilowatt of power. And then by 2028, they'll start rolling out next to power stations. So instead of using coal, they'll tap into the Earth's mantle, essentially, pump steam back through their turbines, and run 24/7 without using fossil fuels. Interesting where this is going to go. Because at the moment, the only thermo energy that we use is obviously in Kenya on that break, and then in Northern America, and obviously Iceland or Greenland. Next one, these guys. Watch this. The KAUST has started a business to say, how do we extract lithium from seawater? And these chaps came along and they sort of developed a RO kind of technology, and from the RO technology, they then used electricity to get rid of the oxygen and the hydrogen, and they're now left with a lithium product. So they've already put, I think, $8 million into this, and the first plant is now going up. And their claims at the moment are saying that we'll produce a kilogram of lithium for $5. Okay, and we'll recover the $5 from selling the oxygen and hydrogen. If that happens, the lithium market is going to tank completely. Final take home. Urbanization will increase. The opportunities will definitely come in the form of QSRs. It's going to happen. Okay. The growth in Zimbabwe is actually more than what the population is. The population increase is about 2%. I know the government's saying 6%. I think the World Bank is saying now it's about 1.8 something. But there's growth. I mean, when you fly over, you see people are building. Things are happening. They're happening. So it's not standing still. The poultry industry is going to expand because of that. It's just a natural phenomenon. Where and how will it happen? As the QSRs increase, somewhere along the line, somebody's going to say, hold on, we need contract growing. The best contract growers are the guys with the best tech. And it's the guys that make the most money, and it's the guys that pay their houses off the fastest. final words, invest into the youth as much as what you can. Keep them here. Have incentive programs. Have mentorship programs. You're going to see the benefit. Thank you.